easily push output above
that could easily push output above
what the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
what the Congressional Budget Office that is what the Congressional Budget Office
potential level. What the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
What the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
That is the amount the economy can produce.
That is the amount the economy can produce.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
This possibility has some American economists
On the
lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
On the lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
Should overheating occur, its effects will not be confined within its borders.
Its effects will not be confined within its borders.
Depending on how the recovery plays out.
Depending on how the recovery plays out.
A hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
A hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
Or yet another source of concern. In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world.
In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world.
Too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices. And too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices. Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices. Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices. Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
Whereas too much should eventually push
prices. Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
While too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand.
In the open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
to the rest of the world.
Spill over to the rest of the world.
A sharp drop in spending, for instance,
may be associated with plunging demand for imports.
In which case some of the pain of the slump is exported abroad.
During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008,
troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
Troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
But even countries relatively insulated from those woes felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe. According to one estimate, about a quarter of the drop in American demand.
According to one estimate, about a quarter of the fall in demand in American economy, and a fifth of the fall in the European demand
was borne by other economies,
was born by other economies and transmitted through trade.
A boost to demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
A boost to demand ought to work in similar ways, but in the other direction.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaked abroad.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example.
With purchases of foreign goods, for example.
Or spending on services, including tourism. Or spending on services, including tourism.
Or spending in services like tourism.
Which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
Which should rebound as restrictions
An analysis of fiscal policy as pandemic restrictions are lifted. Which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
Which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers.
An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers
Published by the IMF in 2017 found
out
that an American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts
that American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts
and worth 1% of GDP
and 1% of GDP
rate
and worth 1% of GDP
raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year.
Raises the output of the average country by 0.33%.
By 0.33% in the first year.
In the first year.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
The Philip II Canada's economy is estimated to be
The Philip II Canada economy is expected
almost
to
three
be
times the average, for example.
Almost 3 times the average, for example.
The combination of reopening and stimulus
If the combination of reopening and stimulus
invigorates the American consumer, the effects could quickly be felt all over the world.
Invigorates American consumer, the effect could be felt all over the world.
The degree to which it is felt, however, depends crucially on the policy response both at home and abroad.
Depends heavily on the policy response both at home and abroad.
Spillovers are more powerful
Fiscal spillovers are more powerful
when recipient countries are themselves operating below potential.
when recipient countries themselves are operating below potential.
American spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
America's spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
if its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
if its recovery is much stronger than those of the trading partners.
Ordinarily, spillovers provide a strong incentive
Ordinarily, spillovers provide strong incentives
to coordinate their stimulus efforts.
for governments to coordinate their stimulus efforts.
Lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe,
Lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe,
free ride on the largesse leaking from more generous ones.
free ride on the largest leaking from more generous ones.
Indeed, on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
Indeed, on February 12th, America's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen
urged her counterparts in the G7 group of countries
urged his counterparts in the group of G7 group of countries
to go big on stimulus too.
to go big on stimulus too.
Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen.
Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen.
The Biden administration has promised to be stern with countries
The Biden administration has promised to be stern with those countries
persistent trade surpluses.
that run large, persistent trade surpluses.
But if America does come close to overheating,
But if America does come close to overheating,
then a reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual.
then the reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual.
Demand-starved countries serve as a release valve
As demand-starved countries serve as a release valve
for the pressure building up at home.
for the pressure building up at home.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its pressure-relieving capabilities.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its releasing capabilities.
According to work by Jane Eyrick, Stephen Kamin, Deborah Lintner, and Jamie Marquez of the Federal Reserve.
According to work by ABNC of the Federal Reserve,
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link.
they found that
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link
expansion in trade has served to weaken the link
between changes in domestic demand and corresponding shifts in total output.
between changes in domestic demand and the total output,
With net exports bearing more of the burden,
with net exports bearing more of the burden
adjustment to changes in domestic spending. Of adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
of adjustment to changes in domestic spending. Adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
In the late 1990s, for instance, measures of domestic demand grew even faster
In the late 1990s, for instance, the measures of the domestic demand grew faster
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
than the real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
Inflation remained relatively subdued, however, in part
Inflation remains subdued, however, in part
because America's current account deficit swelled.
because America's current deficit swelled.
Similarly, a surge in imports this year
Similarly, a surge in imports this year
might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America.
might dissipate
Inflationary pressures in America might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America. Might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America. Might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America.
might dissipate inflationary pressures in America
while giving a lift to its weaker trade partners.
while giving a lift to its weaker trading partners.
The biggest uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy
The biggest uncertainty of
hot American economy. The biggest uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy
the biggest uncertainty to the effects of a hot American economy
is the reaction of the Fed.
is the reaction from the Fed.
Recent work by Kristen Forbes of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology
Recent work by A of the Massachusetts Institute Technology Institute Technology
domestic inflation suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
suggests that
Domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
including the amount of economic slack across the global economy as a whole. Including the amount of economic slack across the global economy as a whole.
Including the amount of economic slack across the global economy.
Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
Yet wage inflation seems mostly a response to
Wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
Yet wage inflation seems to